In the shadows of New York's towering skyline, behind velvet curtains and closed courtroom doors, there was a man who ruled not with fists or fear, but with influence, connections, and quiet power. He wasn't the kind of mob boss who barked orders in dimly lit social clubs or left bodies in trunks. Instead, he attended political fundraisers, dined with mayors, and kept a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. His real name was Frank Costello, but that wasn't the name he was born with, nor the life he was supposed to live. Francesco Castiglia entered the world on January 26, 1891, in the rugged hills of Calabria, Italy. Like many poor southern Italians of the time, his family sought something better. In 1895, young Francesco, just 4 years old, boarded a ship with his mother and brother Edward and made the long journey to America to reunite with their father, who had already settled in East Harlem, New York City. The Castiglias were just another immigrant family trying to survive, running a small grocery store in a neighborhood brimming with other newcomers, struggle, and crime. As a boy, Frank, he had started using that name to sound more American, was smart, observant, and sharp. But he wasn't content sweeping floors at the family shop. Under his older brother's guidance, he drifted into the streets and into gangs. By age 13, he was committing petty crimes, running with street thugs, and learning the rules of survival from those who enforced them with brass knuckles and straight razors. He had charm, but behind it, there was ambition, a hunger for more than just scraps. Arrested multiple times in his teens for robbery and assault, Costello quickly learned that muscle could only get you so far. The real power, he discovered, was in staying just visible enough to matter, but never enough to be blamed. In 1914, at the age of 23, he married Loretta Geigerman, a Jewish woman whose German-born parents likely didn't expect their daughter to wed a future Mafia boss. That same year, Frank was caught carrying a concealed weapon. He served 10 months in jail, but something shifted. When he got out, he made a decision, one that would define his rise in the criminal world. He would use his brains, not his fists. During Prohibition, America's streets ran with illegal liquor, and the men who controlled it became kings. That was when Costello met Charlie "Lucky" Luciano, a Sicilian street hustler who, like Frank, wanted to change the way organized crime worked. The two became fast friends and partners, a rare bond in a world where betrayal was currency. But not everyone approved. Some old-school mafiosi sneered at Costello, calling him the dirty Calabrian. He wasn't Sicilian, and that made him suspect. But Luciano didn't care. He saw in Costello what others didn't: loyalty, vision, and a mind built for business. Together, with a crew that included Vito Genovese, Tommy Lucchese, and Jewish associates like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Costello helped form a powerful syndicate that moved liquor through speakeasies, bribed police, and flooded the streets with money. And while others focused on territory or brute force, Costello looked beyond, toward politics, gambling, and influence. By the early 1920s, Costello had already aligned himself with Irish mobsters like Owney Madden and Bill Dwyer, helping them manage a massive bootlegging operation known as the Combine. It was likely during this time that Frank adopted the surname Costello to better blend in with his Irish counterparts. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was trying to be everything: Italian, Irish, Jewish, whoever helped the business grow. It was this adaptability that made him indispensable. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. In 1926, Costello and Dwyer were indicted for bootlegging after allegedly bribing 2 U.S. Coast Guardsmen to look the other way while thousands of cases of liquor were unloaded in New York Harbor. The trial ended with a hung jury, and Frank walked. When Dwyer went to prison shortly after, Costello, along with Madden, took over the Combine. That power grab sparked a bloody rivalry known as the Manhattan Beer Wars, with another gangster, Vannie Higgins, claiming he should have inherited Dwyer's territory. Alliances crumbled, bullets flew, and the streets turned red. But through it all, Costello remained calm, calculating, and always one step ahead. By 1929, the landscape of American organized crime was shifting. Violence was bad for business, and there were smarter men who wanted to organize, not annihilate. Johnny Torrio, a seasoned Chicago mobster, helped broker peace among East Coast bootleggers by forming the Big Seven, a cartel of crime bosses that included Costello, Luciano, Lansky, and others. That same year, these men met in Atlantic City, not to fight, but to plan. Out of that meeting was born the National Crime Syndicate, a unified front of mobsters from every ethnicity and city working together for profit. But the real turning point came in 1931, during what would be known as the Castellammarese War, a violent struggle between two mafia titans, Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Costello, ever the strategist, stayed close to Luciano, who secretly agreed to betray his boss, Masuria, in exchange for Maranzano's favor. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masuria to a restaurant in Coney Island. As Luciano excused himself to the restroom, gunmen stormed in and gunned Masuria down. The killers, it was said, included Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia. Ciro Terranova, the getaway driver, froze behind the wheel and had to be shoved aside. It was a mess, but it was also a message. The old ways were over. Luciano took over Masuria's family and made Costello his consigliere. But their alliance with Maranzano didn't last. When Luciano learned Maranzano planned to betray him too, he struck first. This time, he sent in Jewish hitmen, faces Maranzano wouldn't recognize. On September 10, 1931, they stormed his office and killed him. With both bosses dead, Luciano and Costello did something no one had done before. They created the Commission, a governing board to manage mafia business across the country. Frank Costello wasn't just a participant, he was a founding architect. Now consigliere of the most powerful crime family in America, Costello began to build a different kind of empire. While Luciano dealt with internal mafia politics, Frank focused on revenue. Slot machines, to be precise. Thousands of them. He installed them in bars, cafes, gas stations, even bus stops. The money flowed in like a river. But not everyone was pleased. In 1934, New York's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, made a public spectacle of smashing Costello's machines and dumping them into the river. If Frank was embarrassed, he didn't show it. He simply looked south. That same year, Louisiana's populist Governor Huey Long made him an offer. Bring your slot machines to my state, and I'll give you 10% of the cut. Costello accepted. He sent his associate, Phil Castile, to oversee operations, backed by the rising New Orleans gangster Carlos Marcello. The machines were reinstalled, this time in Baton Rouge, not Brooklyn, and they made millions. Frank Costello didn't just adapt, he expanded. He was becoming more than a gangster. He was becoming a kingmaker. But power came at a cost. In 1936, Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to decades in prison. From behind bars, he tried to keep the family running through Costello and Lansky, but it was difficult. Vito Genovese stepped in as acting boss, until 1937, when he fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge. With Genovese gone, Luciano made it official. Costello was now acting boss. Willie Moretti, his trusted cousin, became underboss. Costello ran things quietly, efficiently, and with minimal violence. Unlike the brutal enforcers of his time, Frank didn't like blood. He preferred bribes over bullets. And the judges, politicians, and police captains he had cultivated over the years paid off. Under his leadership, the Luciano family remained powerful, profitable, and relatively low-key. But in the background, Genovese was watching. And he wasn't done. When Vito Genovese returned to the United States in 1945, he brought more than just ambition. He brought a vendetta. The murder charges against him had conveniently vanished after the mysterious deaths of two key witnesses, and now, with Luciano still exiled in Italy, Genovese saw a clear path to reclaim the family he believed was rightfully his. But one man stood in his way, Frank Costello. Genovese made his intentions known, subtly at first, then with increasing force. He lobbied Luciano to install him as the overall boss, to let Costello step aside as a formality. Luciano refused. He had chosen Costello for a reason. Costello wasn't just a capable administrator, he was a unifying figure, respected across mafia factions and political circles alike. Genovese's ambition, while obvious, was abrasive. Costello, for all his influence, didn't try to dominate others. That made him powerful and dangerous. By the early 1950s, Costello had become the face of organized crime without ever intending to be. The public didn't see a street thug or a thug in a trench coat. They saw a dignified, almost regal figure who lived in the Waldorf Astoria, wore tailored suits, and spoke with a calm confidence. But it was this very visibility that drew heat. In 1950, the U.S. Senate launched a sweeping investigation into organized crime, led by Senator Estes Kefauver. The hearings would become a national sensation, broadcast live on television, and they would change the way Americans viewed the Mafia forever. When Frank Costello was called to testify, he refused to allow his face to be shown on camera. It was a calculated move, but one that backfired. The cameras instead focused on his hands, twitching and fidgeting as he gave evasive answers. His voice, smooth and firm, betrayed only hints of tension. But the image of those restless hands became iconic. America wasn't just hearing about the Mafia now. They were watching it, in real time, and Costello had unwittingly become its poster boy. After refusing to answer certain financial questions, Costello abruptly walked out of the hearing, citing a sore throat. He returned days later, but remained tight-lipped. The public, however, had already seen enough. He was convicted of contempt of the Senate and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The legend of Frank Costello, the man who mingled with mayors and never carried a gun, was now being dissected in living rooms across the country. The hearings also led to another tragedy. Willie Moretti, Costello's loyal underboss and cousin, had begun behaving erratically. He had syphilis and it was affecting his brain. The Mafia Commission feared that his loose talk before the Senate might get worse. On October 4, 1951, they decided to act. Moretti was gunned down in a restaurant in New Jersey. It was an execution disguised as necessity, but the message was clear. No one was above suspicion, not even family. Costello, weakened by prison time and now lacking his closest ally, made a fateful decision. He appointed Genovese as his new underboss, perhaps hoping that appeasement might protect him. But Genovese saw it differently. To him, it was a signal of vulnerability. And now, he was ready to make his final move. On May 2, 1957, Frank Costello returned home to his Manhattan apartment. As he entered the lobby, a man emerged from the shadows and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's head, but miraculously he survived. The gunman fled, later identified as none other than Vincent, the Chin Gigante, acting on orders from Genovese. When questioned by authorities, Costello kept his code. He claimed he couldn't identify the shooter. That refusal saved Gigante, who was acquitted, and it ended Costello's reign. Costello understood the message. The hit hadn't failed. It had succeeded in its purpose. Genovese had tested him and made it clear that if he didn't step aside, the next bullet wouldn't miss. In a rare moment of pragmatism, Costello did something most mafia bosses never do. He retired. He relinquished control of the family, which would soon be renamed in honor of its new leader, the Genovese crime family. But Genovese's victory was short-lived. Later that same year, Albert Anastasia, the brutal boss of the Mangano crime family, was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop. Genovese had orchestrated the hit with help from Carlo Gambino, planning to install Gambino as the new boss. At the infamous Appalachian meeting in November 1957, Genovese brought together mafia leaders from across the country to formalize his power. But the meeting was raided by state police. The mobsters fled into the woods, muddy and humiliated. It was a disaster that shattered Genovese's credibility. By 1959, Genovese was in prison, convicted of heroin trafficking in a federal sting operation, one that some believe was quietly arranged by Luciano, Lansky, and even Costello himself as revenge. Genovese would die behind bars, a bitter man who had claimed the crown but lost the kingdom. As for Frank Costello, his retirement was unlike any other in Mafia history. He didn't disappear into obscurity or flee the country. Instead, he remained in his Waldorf Astoria suite, attended garden shows, and continued to receive visitors, some of them Mafia bosses, others politicians and businessmen. Gambino, Lucchese, and Lansky all came to him, seeking advice, guidance, or simply paying respects. Though he no longer held formal power, his influence never really left. In quiet rooms and behind closed doors, he was still the prime minister of the underworld. Even the government couldn't figure out what to do with him. In 1952, Costello was stripped of his U.S. citizenship. He fought the order in court, and in 1961, the Supreme Court upheld it. But just 3 years later, in a legal twist, his deportation was blocked due to a technicality. Once again, Frank Costello had slipped through the cracks. His later years were surprisingly serene. He tended to his flowers, enjoyed his wealth, and stayed out of the limelight. But the shadows never fully left him. In 1974, after his death, someone bombed the doors of his mausoleum in Queens. The prime suspect? Carmine Galante, recently released from prison and hungry to reclaim lost power. Even in death, Costello's name provoked fear. Frank Costello died on February 18, 1973, at the age of 82, following a heart attack. His funeral was small and quiet, just 50 mourners, including family, old friends, and several curious law enforcement agents taking notes from the back of the room. He was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, in a private mausoleum built to last forever, though not even granite was immune to the ghosts of vendettas. Today, Frank Costello's legacy remains both fascinating and paradoxical. He was a gangster who hated violence, a criminal who dined with governors, a man who could quote Shakespeare and make senators squirm. Unlike Luciano, he never went to war. Unlike Genovese, he never demanded absolute control. He played the long game, the political game, and for decades, he won. He showed the world a different kind of power. Not loud, not flashy, but deeply rooted, institutional, and enduring. He didn't just bribe the system. He became part of it. And for a time, Frank Costello wasn't just another mob boss. He was the one they all came to when they wanted to be heard. If you're fascinated by the hidden power plays, secret alliances, and untold stories behind history's most notorious crime bosses, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Inside the Secret World of Mafia Titans for exclusive deep dives into the minds and empires of the underworld's most feared figures. Ever wondered what truly separates a street thug from a criminal mastermind? Let's uncover it, one story at a time.